Hello everybody, John here again. In last week's video I talked about a shelf that I built out of red oak, which you can see is this right here. Again, I chose this material because well, I have a lot of it. I purchased it a while ago. It's really cheap. You can find it in North Carolina. It's pretty easy to work with. I mean, it's not as soft as poplar, but it does have some strength, and it's a lot cheaper than white oak. All right, so in last week's video, I talked about the joinery I used being a dado, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about that today, show you what a dado stack looks like, and then make some cuts with this shelf. So again, last week's joinery was a dado cut, which looks like this, and then the shelf sits in it to have a lot of stability. I did kind of go briefly about a dado versus a groove, and I have this little test piece here to show you. A dado is across the grain, so as you can see the grain is going vertically in this take right here. A groove is across the grain, or sorry, a dado is across the grain and a groove is with the grain. So here is this piece that fits into this groove right here, and you can see it actually fits in quite snug and actually quite nicely. And then a dado against the grain this way. Now to make this cut, I used a dado stack, which is, you can buy them for table saws. I'll go into them in a minute. But you could make this cut with a single blade going multiple passes. And that's what this is right here. I don't know, I'm going to see if I can get this kind of close up here. If you look, bear with me, maybe not. Anyways, if you were to look at this, you could see that there's multiple passes in here, and this cut area right here is actually quite wavy. So when you have a piece that connects with it, it does not have a tight joint. You can kind of see there, and it is a little wavy. Opposed to the dado stack, which is a flat top cut, which means that this top area right here is relatively flat. When you add the piece in, it has almost like a seamless, my camera really doesn't want to focus on a seamless cut, and you don't get the waviness of the multiple passes. Now that is mainly due to the blades that we have are combination blades, which means left tooth, right tooth, center tooth, and they kind of have a little bit of wavy approach to it. But you can get flat top blades as well. So anyways, this saw right here, I have a dado stack already set into it. Then to show you what a dado stack kind of is it's a set of blades. Typically there is a full blade on the left and a full blade on the right, and then in between, and there's a difference between style, there's these unique blades that actually go in between and make up the wide or variety of thicknesses. Now the thickness on these blades are typically roughly maybe a little less than 1/8 of an inch. So if you have 4 of them together, you're going to have a 1/2 inch or 4/8 1/2 inch blade thickness. Now because material stock ranges in thickness, they typically come with these shim spacers that have the thickness on that go between the pieces, and that allows you to vary the thickness of the cut. I set this to 4 1/8 inch pieces, and then I actually milled my material, and I'm going to walk out of frame for a second. I actually milled my shelves to that exact thickness. Now, I find that to be a little bit easier than setting this up and then or milling the pieces and then trying to get this exactly to that thickness of the material. Sometimes you have to go back and forth with shims, so I just like to set this at a thickness and then set the planer to that thickness so I can mill all my stuff and have them fit perfectly snug, just like that. Okay, so I have my shelves, I have the thickness set, and I'm going to talk to you briefly about my 2 sides here. So you can see I have the 2 sides of my shelf. On one of them I have already marked out where I want my dados to go. I actually picked, and see if you can see this, a reference line, and then this is basically the thickness of the shelf. And then I followed that reference line to the edge here. So when I set up, I know that this is the edge of it, and I'm cutting to the right of that line. So I can set it up for multiple cuts with the stop block, which I'll show in a minute. So I only drew it on one because I'm going to set this up with my cross-cut sled and the stop block, and then cut it, and then cut the other piece simultaneously. That'll make sure that when I have, you can see I actually have these two reference pieces, meaning the back. When I make the cuts, they're going to be perfectly parallel, or follow through to both pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and set up, move these out of frame. Cross-cut sled here, and I'm going to set the thickness of my material. So I have this, and I'm going to lower that blade until I'm about maybe a little less than halfway. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and make a test cut. Got to make sure to turn the machine on first. Let's see. Waiting for the saw stop to turn on. There we go. And I made that cut. It looks pretty good. It's about 1/4 inch deep. I'll check that. It's actually perfectly 1/4 inch. Good eyeball. Okay. So I'm going to take my piece. Now this is, again, the one that I put reference lines on, and I'm going to set up the edge of the blade to my mark here, set a stop block, and then make continuous cuts. Few things laying around, bear with me. All right, so I have everything lined up. Set up the next cut. Now I'm not too worried about the accuracy of setting this up in a way, as long as the stop block remains in the same place with both of my cuts. That way it'll be the same. So if I'm off by 1/8 of an inch or so, it's not going to matter too much with this project. Now if you're working with a project that you have to be extremely careful about your dimensions, this would be a little bit of a slower process. Now, unfortunately, with how my sled is positioned, I'll have to transfer from setting a stop block to this side to my right side. Now, preferably, I don't like to do this because I'm actually changing my reference point. If the cuts I made previously were slightly skewed, then there could be an issue. But I believe with this setup, I'll be just fine. Now you can see that over here I am using the fence in parallel with the crosscut sled, but I've actually put in a sacrificial, I say sacrificial, but a stop block right here so that when I reference it and I actually get to the point of making contact with the blade, there's a gap here, okay? You never want to use a crosscut sled with the fence. There's a binding point right there. So again, by the time it makes contact, there is a gap here, so there is a ability for the material to move if need be, and it's not going to shoot up at me. Now I can transition back to using the crosscut sleds fence. Making sure everything looks good. Now, I would continue to make the next 2 cuts that I need on here, but it will actually interfere with the camera placement. So I'm going to go ahead and move the crosscut to the side and just show you what it looks like